Hey, all. I'm going to fill in for Darnell. I know that Darnell's having a little bit of technical trouble with his computer that shut down on him. So I want to welcome everyone. We have so many people joining on for the sixth installment of the Renter Nation training series. My name is Malcolm, and I work with Right to the City and Homes for All. And we are incredibly honored and thrilled to have the crew from Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson, which is a core member of Right to the City and a leading member of the new Homes for All Utility Justice Working Group, on today to share about their cutting-edge report and organizing for solutions to the household energy crisis. So we're going to start off with a little bit of background on this training and Homes for All, and then we're going to jump right into the presentation. There'll be a lot of time for question and answer and discussion, but particularly want to encourage folks to be using the chat box in the bottom left of your screen. Darnell, I see you chiming in on the chat. Go ahead and take over whenever you are able to get back on, okay? Okay. So, great. And then we'll be talking some about next steps. All right, let me give you all a little bit of background about Homes for All. So Homes for All is a national campaign that was initiated by the Right to the City Alliance in 2013 by our Housing Justice Work Group. There's three kind of really key core principles of Homes for All that guide the work. One, housing is a human right, not a commodity to be exploited for profit. Two, that housing and land is fundamentally about racial justice and winning Black liberation, as well as achieving justice for communities of color, understanding that housing and land and access to housing and land impacts communities of color disproportionately and historically in ways disproportionately. And finally, land and housing, we believe, should be collectively owned and controlled by communities, and the resources that our communities need should be collectively owned and controlled by our communities. Homes for All started in 2013 with 18 organizations. In the last year, it's exploded in membership, and there are now 55 partner organizations operating in 30 cities and 20 states. And the work of Homes for All is organized under three core translocal strategies. So the first is renters' rights, which moves organizing campaigns to organize groups of renters into renters' unions and renters' associations, as well as resident associations and formations to defend and advance the fight for renters' rights. Development Without Displacement, which is our newest translocal strategy group, which is leading campaigns and strategy work around the country to put forward a vision of development in our cities that does not include displacement and an alternative to the type of neoliberal gentrification that we see impacting and plaguing our communities. And finally, the Alternative Land and Housing Model Translocal Strategy Group, which is particularly right now focusing on community land trust, but is beginning to branch out to thinking about community control in more cohesive and expansive ways. And in terms of utility justice, we're incredibly excited that at our most recent Homes for All strategy retreat in Chicago in April, the crew from Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson brought forward a proposal to the entire Homes for All partnership and spent 2 days together strategizing, developing vision and plans for what it would look like to adopt utility justice as a key plank of our work. And it was brought to the floor and approved to be part of our renters' rights platform, that we understand that if we're talking about housing, if we're talking about development, if we're talking about displacement, we have to be talking about utility justice, and we have to be talking about environmental justice. It's deeply and intrinsically linked to the fight for housing, renters' rights, and control over land and resources. So this is very new to Homes for All. It's not new to Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson, and it's not new to so many of you on the call. And we're very excited to be initiating this and learning from all of you on the call. So this training series is key right now to address this moment, to build connections, expand our organizing, and share successful work. But more than anything, we want to seize this opportunity now to build out the housing justice movement and the broader movements to win. And to be able to do that, we think we need to recognize the historic moment we're in, and we need to be willing and able to put forward bold and creative solutions in terms of our strategies and our tactics. We need to evolve our organizing models, which we're really excited to hear about the ways that Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson is evolving their organizing models and has evolved their organizing models. And then this series is also about spreading victories and sharing what's working to be able to support new groups in taking on new organizing or deepening their existing organizing. So that's a little bit about Homes for All. For the webinar today, we're going to be using this chat box, so feel free throughout the throughout the webinar to use the chat box and Twitter, and to use the chat box. We also encourage you to use Twitter to tweet about this webinar, and we'll be using the hashtags JustUtilities and Homes for All, and the two handles are at HFA_RenterPower and at No One Leaves Mid-Hud. So please, we encourage you to share this with the world on Twitter. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to the Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson crew, and thank you all for being on today. Oh, sorry, my bad. The presenters, to introduce them, are Jason Gant, a leader of Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson, Spencer Resnick, a Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson organizer, Jonathan Bix, the executive director of Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson, Margaret Kwateng, another organizer at Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson, Peggy Kahn, who's the principal author of the report, and Anthony Giancatarino, who's from the Center for Social Inclusion and has been involved with the statewide New York Energy Democracy Alliance. So welcome all, and thank you so much for being on with us.
Okay. Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson is located in Poughkeepsie, New York, and we're a base-building organization of working-class people and people of color. Most of our members are Black women. We use direct action and advocacy to build power, to support social movements, and transform systems at the root of economic injustice, racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression. We were founded as an all-volunteer organization in 2012 thanks to support from City Life Vida Urbana and the Right to the City Alliance. And we eventually took on our first staff in mid-2014. When we first started, we focused on organizing on preventing foreclosure and eviction using City Life's model of direct action and legal defense. You may ask why utilities matter. Utilities matter not just to me, but to all of us. Since the advent of electricity, all people have grown to rely on power, to see, to wash their clothes, to maintain a decent standard of living. Without power, we're from another era. It's my feeling that utilities must be fought for despite the escalating costs that have made it unaffordable to many people. It's essential that we fight for utilities despite the greed of corporations who provide the utilities. If we don't fight, we lose our power. In my situation, power is essential for my family. For example, my daughter goes to school with other children. Their homework requires computers. It requires us to be able to see the homework on the table. After all, it's 2016. I would like to be able to provide food for her, a clean environment for her, a safe and healthy environment for her. When my electric bills are a significant portion of my income, it crowds that out. For me, I've paid 40% of my income to my utility, Central Hudson. We have to ask ourselves, at what point do we have a crisis? Sitting next to me, Jonathan Bix, Executive Director of Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson, has insights that speak to the nature of this ongoing catastrophe.
Thank you, Jason. And it is the depth of this crisis, along with its lack of examination thus far, that makes us excited to be bringing you all this report and reviewing it together on this webinar. We switched from organizing around foreclosure to organizing around energy utilities at the end of 2014 because our members came to us with the same issues that Jason described. They couldn't afford their gas and electric utilities and were getting their heat and electricity shut off. Even if it was winter, there were elderly or sick people in the home, or there were children in the home. In the rest of my section, I'm going to be giving you an overview of our organizing model, so we'll elaborate on that later. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why organizing around utilities is strategic and presents an opportunity for the climate justice movement. So an overview of our model. People come to us because their power is about to be shut off. And through a combination of methods, we prevent the shutoff and then integrate them into our fight against the utility monopoly in our area, Central Hudson Gas and Electric, or for short, Central Hudson. And from there, we integrate members into our statewide work with the Energy Democracy Alliance. So our model is a laddering process where people go from number one, preventing their own shutoff, to number two, working with other members to change corporate policy that leads to local unaffordability and shutoffs, to number three, working with people around the state to change the public policy at the root of both the affordability and the climate change crises. And so now that you have a bit of an overview of how we do our work, I'm going to discuss the three reasons that makes energy utilities a particularly strategic organizing issue, and that's also elaborated on in the report's conclusion. So strategic point one, there's a widespread and severe national crisis. We have an energy affordability map of the United States on page 5 of the executive summary and page 49 of the full report. And on it, you can see that in about 3 out of every 4 states, very poor people are paying at least 5 times the affordable amount for energy utilities. To be affordable, your bill should be capped at 6% or less of your income. And the outcome of this is that there are many people with the motivation to organize around these. Strategic point 2 is that there's a geographically concentrated base and a local corporate target. So I'll explain what that means. By there being a geographically concentrated base, I mean that energy utility companies are distribution monopolies, where 100% of people on the grid within their service territory are their customers. So in other words, everyone in a county or city doesn't have the same employer. They don't have the same landlord, but they do have the same energy utility company, and they can be organized to take action against that company. And for the second part, when I say there's a local corporate target, I mean that utility company headquarters are usually located within their service territory. So that presents an accessible target for direct action and advocacy, unlike, for example, a national bank that's headquarters are probably far away. Strategic point 3 is that there's a state regulatory target. So while state legislators have some role in utility policy, ongoing regulation is concentrated in statewide public service commissions. And while these commissions have drawbacks as targets compared to legislatures, they also have advantages. And advantages include that these commissions deal with a narrower range of issues, they have fewer decision makers, and they have a regulatory mission. But what's ultimately strategic is that commissions are an additional public body where policy gains can be won in complement with legislative efforts. And these last 2 strategic points I made, that energy utilities have a geographically concentrated base and that there's a state regulatory target in the work. Those things are true in every state. So our organizing model is reproducible state to state. And in conclusion, I just want to stress that the strategicness of energy affordability work leads to an opportunity for the climate justice movement. Climate change does disproportionately impact low-income people of color. But for many low-income communities and communities of color, energy affordability is still more immediately felt than climate change. So by supporting energy affordability organizing and by linking energy affordability work with the climate justice movement, which we can do because ultimately we'll only get both climate justice and affordability by having a democratic energy system run for the benefit of people and not corporations, we can bring many more low-income people and people of color into the climate justice movement and open more space for their leadership. So we're excited to grow energy utility work nationally for these reasons and really excited that you all are here to do that with us.
Cool. So we have a poll that we wanted to do, send out to you all. Great. Malcolm has pulled that up for us. So take a second to look at the poll. We want to know what brings you here today. And we can then coordinate coming out of this webinar around people's interests. And I should check in with Darnell. Are you with us? Floating? Okay, Darnell is with us, but he can't be heard. So, Malcolm, is it possible for you to just do the little transition?
For sure.
Thanks.
So we'll give folks another 20 seconds to vote in the poll. And a lot of folks on this call, about a third of you on the call, are already doing utility organizing right now. So you have things to offer. You're here. We want to learn from you, and we're trying to build together. About 40% of folks are here to learn about utility organizing, so how to start organizing work. And 10 folks, 17%. Oh, I'm sorry. There's 15 people from Detroit, and they are in process of taking a poll with those 15 people. Give it up for the Detroit folks who organized 15 people in a room to call into this together. A number of folks are here to learn specifically about policy recommendations, and a few folks are here for other reasons as well. So we're going to transition into digging into the actual report findings and recommendations with Ms. Peggy Kahn and the rest of the Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson team. And most in Detroit have offered that they are here because they're already doing utility justice organizing, but are interested in learning about organizing strategies and policy work. I want to pass it back to Spencer.
Cool. Well, we have with us the author of the report, who contributed a lot of energy with the co-author, Bill Hoynes, into making it possible and synthesizing a lot of the experiences we've learned here in Poughkeepsie. So I'm going to turn it over to Peggy Kahn to walk us through.
Hello, and thank you very much for attending the webinar. I'm Peggy Kahn, and one of the principal writers of the report. The other main writer is Bill Hoynes, professor of sociology at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York, and we work closely with Nobody Leaves staff and others. And I'm just going to touch very briefly on some of the content. This report was an effort to combine the knowledge emerging from the experience of Nobody Leaves members like Jason Gant, whom you've met, and Nobody Leaves organizers with more systematic data and policy information. And though some of the report discusses the organizing model, the next few slides focus on the household energy insecurity problem and possible policy solutions. Nobody Leaves organizes in the city of Poughkeepsie, so the report concentrates on the city and the surrounding county, Dutchess County, and its members' struggles with household energy provide a kind of case study of what is a far broader crisis. Household utilities are a critical but often neglected component of housing security and housing justice. It's often the combined cost of rent and utilities that results in displacement and household hardship. Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson members describe needing a roof over their heads, but they also describe how walls in a roof without heat or electricity are a difficult and dangerous space and not really a home. So household utilities refer to a variety of services providing a foundation for everyday living. They include water, telephones, access to the internet. This particular report focuses on household energy. So the term utilities refers not only to the services themselves, but to the entities that provide them. And household energy is generally distributed by what are called public utilities, but are actually private corporations. They are for-profit and investor-owned, and they're often part of larger energy conglomerates. So in Poughkeepsie, the local utility company is Central Hudson Gas and Electric, and it's actually part of a Canadian-based energy conglomerate called Fortis. These private entities are regulated by state-level public service commissions, generally appointed by governors. These commissions oversee multiple aspects of the services utilities provide, including rate structures, assistance programs, and importantly, access to services. And they oversee a piece of legislation in every state, sometimes referred to as a Household Utilities Bill of Rights. These statutes create consumer rights with respect to utilities, energy utilities. And in New York, this is the Home Energy Fair Practices Act. So the report in general uses the framework of 4 pillars as principles of utility justice. This framework is useful both for naming the problems and exploring policy solutions, and they closely resemble the 5 pillars that guide Right to the City's housing justice work. And underlying these separate principles is a unifying idea that basic household energy should not be seen as a market commodity, but as a basic human need and a social right. So the first pillar is affordability. The principle that utility rates should be affordable relative to household income and other basic expenses. A second pillar is accessibility. Households should be able to access the household energy they require and be protected from shutoff, the gravest violation of the principle of accessibility. The third pillar is health. Household energy use should contribute to the health and social well-being of families, communities, and the environment. Household energy conservation and efficiency are important, and use of renewable resources should be maximized. And the fourth pillar is community control. Low-income communities should participate regularly and effectively in regulatory and policy-making processes. They should benefit from weatherization and efficiency, and they should own and control distributed energy resources, those decentralized green technologies. The next few slides try to talk a little bit in general terms about the household energy insecurity crisis. Household energy insecurity at its center is the inability of households to pay utility charges. And as Jonathan Bick said, researchers tend to define affordable energy bills as 6% of gross household income, and we'll see that map in a minute that shows that charges are much higher. And bills that are higher lead to very severe negative impacts. Unhealthy low levels of energy consumption. People don't turn up the thermostat in frigid winter weather. They don't turn on fans or air conditioners in stifling heat, and they don't use appliances they need. Unaffordable bills lead to unsafe alternative uses of heat. Fireplaces become primary heaters, and candles substitute for electric light. Households are forced into undesirable trade-offs among basic necessities. The most well-known of these dilemmas is the heat or eat dilemma. Households cut back on food in order to keep the heat on, especially in winter. There are other distressing trade-offs. Another impact is untenable levels of household debt. Rising levels of debt may begin with or be augmented by utility debt, and then residents take out payday or other loans, get behind on other bills. High costs result in unstable and poor quality housing, and so unaffordable utility and rent bills drive people toward the bottom of the private rental market, and their evictions and displacements become frequent. And when people can't pay their bills over time, despite their many coping strategies, shutoffs result. So this map shows some dimensions of shows the geographic scope and depth of the household energy unaffordability crisis, especially in lower incomes, those below 50% of the official poverty threshold. Households are being charged 30 to 50% of gross income for utilities. And then you can see from the New York State statistic about power shutoffs that shutoffs are not infrequent. They are a troubling and widespread phenomenon. The crisis seems to be due to a combination of factors outside and internal to the household energy sector. Outside, we have falling incomes, high poverty rates, and growing inequality. labor market precarity, a weak social safety net, structural racism and housing insecurity, and factors internal to the household energy sector are the fact that for-profit corporations run utilities. They center on revenue-generating and profit-oriented strategies, and regulation is inadequate. So very briefly, some particular slides about how we documented the energy and security crisis in Poughkeepsie. There's a serious problem of unaffordability. The home energy burden for poor or near poor households in Dutchess County is 2 to 7 times affordable levels. Part of the problem, and this is happening across the country, is that utilities are charging rising fixed monthly service charges that hurt low-income customers, and we have in Poughkeepsie old, inefficient housing stock that is wired for expensive electric heat. We also see mounting arrears, overdue bills, a vast increase certainly since the years of the recession. And as these utility debts accumulate, reaching thousands of dollars, they become impossible to pay, and other problems ensue. Shutoffs are the most severe form of energy insecurity, a grave violation of the principle of access. They usually occur when debt levels reach high levels, and the Public Service Commission in New York has expressed concern that Central Hudson is using termination notices and shutoffs too often for its own revenue collection purposes, disregarding the interests of households. Shutoffs often occur in violation of law, and nationally, low-income African-American households had shutoff rates twice those of white households, and there seem to be serious racial disparities in shutoffs also in Dutchess County. So what are some of the solutions to this crisis of unaffordability? Well, the first set of solutions, and these are detailed more in the report, have to do with changing the structure and the amount of bills and lowering the household energy burden. Some of the models discussed in the report include Connecticut's effort to implement a limit on that ever-rising fixed service charge. California has a structure of inclining delivery rates. That is, the household is charged more, not less, per unit of electricity or gas as it uses more overall volume. I see that Turn is on the webinar, and they can fill in more details. Ohio has a percentage of income payment plan that requires gas and electric utilities to accept payments based on a percentage, 6% of household income for customers at or below 150% of the poverty line. There is also a set of practices and policy solutions that would help ensure access. One part of this is that these consumer bills of rights are in place, but very, very few low-income households know about them. And so organizations can try to inform low-income communities and help them advocate for their rights. Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson has done quite a lot of work with the Legal Rights Clinic and in other groups and on a case-by-case basis. And I know the George Wiley Center is on the call too, and they have won quite a good court order temporarily barring shutoffs to the medically vulnerable. But a second avenue of increasing access is that advocates can work to strengthen the protections written into the law. New York, for example, has no categorical protections for children in the home or for the elderly or for hot weather days. So there's room for better policy there. The report also discusses weatherization and renewables in low-income communities. This would not only expanding and strengthening these programs would not only decrease household bills, but contribute to environmental sustainability. Here, the interests of the environmental movement coincide with those of housing justice organizers. There are many high-level policy reports arguing that weatherization and efficiency updates in low-income households may reduce home energy consumption by as much as 20%. And there's several other recommendations related to weatherization and renewables in the report. In addition, low-income community participation in decision-making is clearly part of energy democracy and can also improve affordability and access and should be increased in a variety of ways in the public bodies that regulate the utilities, in all venues where household energy policies are being discussed, through funding of public interveners who are closely tied to low-income communities. And in some settings, there might be a shift toward publicly owned utilities. This is a movement referred to as municipalization, since it's cities and local jurisdictions that are in a position to create and operate public utilities. And this last slide just summarizes both the problems and the policy, referring to the 4 pillars again.
Right. Thank you so much for that. And hello, everyone. I'm glad to be back in. We have some questions that we wanted to open up the space for questions from the author. Feel free to write your questions in the chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. And so are there any questions that folks have right now for origins of the crisis or the impact of unaffordable utilities? We have one here from Eric. Did you find differences in behavior between IOUs, munis, and rural electric co-ops?
So I can't answer that question in any detail. We didn't really explore that. On the whole, publicly owned utilities tend to have lower charges and more transparent and open decision-making processes.
What fixed costs are causing cost inflation?
Well, there's quite a lot of discussion about what is driving up the costs. One of the arguments is that the grid and the infrastructure needs a lot of investment for various reasons, including adaptation to new technologies, and also issues of hardening that are associated with some of the climate change problems. There is also some concern that the movement toward green technologies is creating a situation of uncertainty and disruption for traditional utilities, and they are therefore raising the fixed service costs to protect against loss of revenue that some of the adoption of green utilities, green technologies may lead to.
Thank you, Peggy. Are there any other questions that folks have around the policy solutions that she outlined? Jackson writes in, there is a sweet spot between policies that target energy efficient affordability and reducing pollution. Is there a sweet spot?
Well, one place that we can see an intersection of those two concerns and possibilities is in the efficiency and weatherization programs that exist. And in New York, the Energy Democracy Alliance is doing some wonderful work on trying to identify most socially, economically, and environmentally endangered communities that also have the capacity to adopt green technologies. And if that map is used, then that would be a very effective way of addressing both pollution and health problems and climate and affordability.
We had a question that came in that said, do you have comparative sense of how consumers' access to pre-termination hearings affect the shutoff?
I think I would have to defer to Nobody Leaves organizers for that question.
Okay.
Cool. We can address that real quick. We don't have those hearings in Central Hudson Service Territory. That's part of the legal framework we're dealing with. And so there's very little line of defense other than knowing and asserting your rights and, frankly, organizing. So I also saw a question from Gianna about how we organize. We'll get into that shortly. But, yeah, we think it makes it particularly critical to both learn our rights and build a movement to combat shutoff.
Okay. We had another question here that said, can you talk a little bit more about where you have seen municipalization or local control of utilities advancing?
So there's several instances
That's
mentioned in the report.
Go ahead, Peggy.
There are several cases in the report, some in Colorado, Winter Park, Florida, and I believe Sacramento are some examples that we mentioned, and there's a little bit more detail, not much in the report.
Are there any other questions before we move on? We want to encourage folks to feel free if we didn't get to your question or if in the later on in the program, feel free to enter your question into the chat box and we'll try to make sure we get it. Oh, wait a minute, hold on. For the Ohio policy that you referenced, do you know any of the studies that have elevated, I don't know that word, the effects on policy and communities and utility revenue? Oh, that evaluates the effects on policy on community.
There's a very informative webinar on the Ohio PIP policy that is accessible on the Low Income Forum on Energy. I think that's what it's called. If Dave gets in touch with me, I can send him details.
All right. And then have you seen any prepayment or pay-as-you-go schemes attempted to be implemented?
Was there a question?
Hey, we just lost Darnell, unfortunately. We're having a catastrophe audio-wise, it sounds like. So, Darnell, give us a big wave when you can make it back on. I think the question from Anthony maybe was, have you seen any prepayment or pay-as-you-go schemes attempted to be implemented? For Peggy.
So I'm not sure what range of pay-as-you-go you're referring to, but the Ohio percentage of payment, percentage of income payment plan could be seen a little bit as a pay-as-you-go, because what it does is it, for people who are accepted onto the plan, it accepts 6% of income or $10 a month as payment of the utility bill in full if it's made on time, and it is linked then to arrearage forgiveness and forgiveness of debt. And so there are other kinds of payments that are, maybe they're not pay-as-you-go, but they're discounted payments or certain kinds of payment plans that are very useful for low-income households.
Cool. Thank you, Peggy. I think we do need to transition, but there was a great comment from Camila in Rhode Island saying, we hope that this new network can foster a push for progressive taxation rather than carbon taxes that can be regressive. And then can you give a critique of class-blind climate activism? So I think that's a good transition. We're going to be talking a little bit more about how we're trying to do movement building and what our organizing can look like. I'm going to transition myself into talking a little bit more about what's going on with so that's something that myself, again, I'm Spencer. I'm an organizer with Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson. Margaret, who is to my right, who's another organizer with Nobody Leaves, and Jason, who you've already met, are going to be talking about. So I think in terms of talking about organizing, where we've seen a few questions on this webinar, we realize that it doesn't matter if we have the best policy solutions in the world, right, if we don't have the power to back it up. That's the double meaning of the People's Power campaign, a name that we really enjoy, because we're fighting for actual power for people's homes, but we know that that requires us to use people power. And as we've mentioned, we really believe that building a movement to make utilities both affordable and controlled by the people, that creates the foundation for shaping an energy system that is both democratic and renewable. And so the stakes are really high. We found that the best way to do this is to build a base of impacted folks and develop the leadership of people who are really experiencing the crisis of unaffordable utilities. And so to do that, we've really got to walk on two legs. We have to win concrete gains that make life more livable in the here and now, while also waging this long-term battle of ideas. So we're not just fighting a single shutoff or a single climate disaster, but an end to the system that makes shutoffs and climate change possible. And so we've been developing a model to do just that, and Jonathan mentioned earlier a little bit about what that looks like. Just from an organizer perspective, we wanted to break that down kind of step by step for you all, because it sounds like the poll showed there are a fair amount of folks who are doing this work or want to be doing this work. We're really excited to compare notes with you all. But very often it comes, someone comes to us with a shutoff notice. We'll be out canvassing at a bus stop or at social services, and someone's really in crisis. What we do at first is we do an intake, get a sense of what's going on with them, what the lay of the land is, and what their situation is. We then offer kind of basic legal knowledge around HEFPA, which is that set of consumer rights that Peggy mentioned earlier, because more often than not, we found there's some kind of violation taking place. And then, because that's often true, we help them file a complaint, consumer complaint, with the regulators, the Public Service Commission. So this is a tool that most folks don't know they have at their disposal, and that the corporation, Central Hudson, is really relying on people not using. And so by doing this kind of limited front-end legal work, we've stopped dozens of shutoffs, and that's a really critical thing. We don't have the thing that I think Robert mentioned in terms of hearings. You have to be able to assert your rights yourself. But we also know that stopping and reversing a shutoff isn't enough. What happens next week, a month from now? We need to change the balance of power and create a long-term solution. So coming out of this kind of casework that we do, we hold meetings where people who have been in crisis come together and really learn that what seems to be an individual problem isn't individual at all. It's a collective problem that requires collective solutions. And so in those meetings, we figure out how we want to take collective action together. And we've done really a wide range of things. We've organized protests at Central Hudson, going right to their headquarters, which is here in Poughkeepsie. We've done a lot of media work, speaking out in the media, changing the narrative around this issue. And we've turned out to public hearings put on by the Public Service Commission. There are supposed to be processes in place, and we want to actually try to mobilize and use those. So along the way, in the process of the struggle, people develop their capacity to continue the fight, to expand the fight. And so what starts really as an individual crisis becomes the basis for a broader political struggle, and that's really the end game for us. So we found that it's important to use these kind of legal defense tools, and that they really complement the more combative public protest tools. And by carving out a little bit of space, a little bit of a defense, we can use that space to push the corporation and the regulator, which is really important. And so doing that, we've been able to win some initial victories. Though I have to say, it's been a learning process, a lot of trial and error. So we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end of this. We want to hear from folks who are doing the work about how it's been going with you. But we're the first organized resistance against Central Hudson in a generation at least, which is exciting but challenging, and we're fighting to make utilities a right and not a privilege. So, we're really have an ambitious agenda, and we're trying to use this model to get there. So we've won victories on a few different levels. So I just put up a slide there. On an individual level, we've stopped 50 shutoffs, which folks who are doing this work know what an impact a shutoff has. And we've created what we call a shutoff-free zone, which for us is a transformative demand, really saying we believe this is a right and not a privilege, and we want that to be a social right. Right now, we're establishing that and enforcing that for members of our group, but the vision is to keep expanding to not just protect folks who join our organization, our movement, but to have that be a right for everybody. And on a local level, in the service territory of Central Hudson, which, as a reminder, is this kind of Hudson Valley region that they operate in, we've had a victory of freezing the basic service charge. Last year, Central Hudson wanted to hike what is already a extremely high flat fee. And, like other utilities, Central Hudson is responding to higher income customers who can access green technologies leaving the grid and pushing those costs onto working class people. And so it disincentivizes conservation. It doesn't matter how little you use, and it disproportionately hurts folks who don't have a lot of income. So they wanted to hike that, and only by speaking out, by protesting, by doing some media work, were we able to get the Public Service Commission to say no to that increase, and we saved about $17 million in fixed fees for customers, and maintain some level of incentive to conserve energy. So that was probably like a defensive victory. A more offensive victory in the service territory is getting Central Hudson under investigation by the Public Service Commission. We've seen just patterns of the same violations over and over again, and we said we need to get to the root of this. And so we met with the PSC. We did some protesting and also some good media work, and we're able to push them to look at why are these violations happening routinely. And we wanted them to zoom in on these patterns of debt collection practices, but also this pattern of racial inequality and shutoffs, which is documented in this report, but also well documented in our experiences here in Poughkeepsie. So that investigation is ongoing. I'd love to be able to give you a positive result, but we hope everyone on this webinar stays tuned to our work so we can let you know where this goes, because we think, the first step toward control of our energy system, that's really democratic, is at least re-regulating corporations like Central Hudson and diving into that. And then the last layer here, as you note, is statewide victories. By working with the New York State Energy Democracy Alliance, we're able to win the first statewide discount program for low-income utility consumers. And the background there is that the PSC also recognized the crisis that's documented in this report, the shutoffs, the debt, the pain that causes, and then proposed a very, very weak program that wouldn't actually address the depths of the crisis, and in doing so failed to consult anyone who would actually use the program. So with our statewide allies, we mobilized, went up to Albany, where the PSC is located, turned out to our local public hearings, and won significant increases in funding and enrollment to the tune of like $70 million and 500,000 people who could be on the program. And that's just a start, and we know that. And that's partly why this report is so important, to see where we can go from here. But we found that working across these local fights, working together on a statewide level, and we're going to hear a little bit more about that work in a second, we were able to win some real gains. And I guess that's a lesson that we've extracted so far, is that you need to be fighting on multiple fronts. You need to be able to win those concrete individual victories. You need to be able to fight the corporation on a local level, and you need to be able to address the regulation, which often happens on a statewide level. And by doing that in small ways, we've seen power shift within the system. But I think another type of victory, which may be as important as, or more important than the rest, is what happens to us when we fight, which is critical for our work. So I wanted to just quickly turn it over to Jason to talk about, that type of victory as well.
Well, a major victory for me is gaining confidence I've always gone to social services on my own and had to work out a deal on my own with them. Now I know that I can go after Central Hudson, the electrical provider, proactively. I don't feel alone anymore. I feel a part of a class that will take action.
Cool. And I'd echo that as well. I think the most important victory we can win is developing our power and vision, because the stakes are really high, but that also means we have a world to win, and that's exciting to me. So I'm going to turn it over to Margaret to talk a little bit more about these movement building aspects, which, I see some comments in the chat bar, are obviously really important and really central to our work.
Yeah, for sure. So we've had so much support in waging this fight, both directly and in partnerships and even in just inspiration. And so some of those groups that have helped us are listed on the slide in front of you. We particularly wanted to call out Pulse and other advocacy organizations that have been focused specifically on utilities justice. The Rhode Island Center for Justice and Turn in California, because they've done so much vital work on forwarding this struggle and representing consumers in the legal arena, particularly in their rights. And then finally, on the right hand of your screen, you'll see there are two organizations listed, the George Wiley Center and Push Buffalo. We just wanted to shout out those two organizations for carrying forward the utility justice struggle, since it's definitely a small arena that folks are organizing in. And those two have been doing really great work. Particularly, Push Buffalo has been building some meaningful alternatives and showing how that can be done in a just way in Buffalo. And so now I get to talk about what Grassroots Global Justice calls building the bigger we. So I was just on a caravan from the Republican National Convention to the Democratic National Convention with 35 other organizers and activists from around the country and Honduras. And we got to really build some significant relationships with people, in Cleveland and in Pittsburgh, in Baltimore, and then in Philly. And I think that was such a vital experience because of the idea that in order to change the crisis that we're fighting against, which is utilities, and the crisis that so many other folks are fighting against, we really need to build cross-movement. We really need to build a larger movement. And so I know that particularly the work that we're doing here in the Hudson Valley is not siloed, and it's necessary that it builds other organizations. And so one way that we've done that is through the Energy Democracy Alliance. And unfortunately, Anthony, who is from the Center for Social Inclusion and was going to this part, can't be here today. So I'm going to read a little bit of what he was planning to say on the Energy Democracy Alliance. Before I do, I just want to introduce the Alliance, which I know that was within the report, but for the sake of recapping. So the Energy Democracy Alliance, also known as the EDA, was founded in the fall of 2014, and it's a collaboration of community-based and advocacy organizations that are working together to advance just and participatory transition to a resilient, localized, and democratically controlled clean energy economy in New York State. So it's really coming out of the REV process, which is Reforming Energy Vision, that was being put forward by Governor Cuomo. And so this was a response to thinking about how do you make that a just transition. So currently, we're focused on building public participation and influence in that major overhaul to the state energy policy, particularly as it's being pushed forward by Governor Cuomo, the Public Service Commission, and the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. So while the EDA is focused on New York's energy regulatory structures, we also wanted to mention our close ally, New York Renews, which is an energy justice alliance focusing on the legislative arena in New York. And a lot of the member organizations of the Energy Democracy Alliance and New York Renews overlap. with the exception of labor, which has a significant presence in New York news. So now I'll move forward to actually reading what Anthony was planning to say. So environmental justice, racial justice, and economic justice work at the intersection. It is not siloed work. It is not just about environmental pollution taking on the criminal justice system or about jobs. It is about all of these and more. To work for environmental, racial, and economic justice is about getting to the structural roots of racism, oppression, and inequity. It means having a structural racial lens to view the challenges and opportunities for change, entry points to transform policies and institutions to create more just communities, and building strategies that begin to dismantle the systemic challenges we face. It's a huge task and requires a multifaceted approach. Environmental justice is about racial justice. It is centering Black Lives Matter in energy, environment, food, transportation, and housing, among others, and finding the entry points to create change. How do we do that? A great framework to think of when we talk about climate change and environmental injustice is the insecurities of climate change. Authored by Diana Hernandez out of Colombia, she finds that there are 3 critical insecurities that will continue to be exacerbated by climate change. 1, housing insecurity. And this deals with displacement, increasing rates of rent, and inaffordability as it relates to utility costs. Second is food insecurity, which is relating to the cost of food and our ability to both produce and have access to healthy food. Third is energy insecurity, which is, like what we're talking about, the cost of energy, which is your ability to pay for heating in the winter and air conditioning in the summer, among the many other uses of energy. And then he says, I would add a 4th, water insecurity for places that are facing deeper droughts. And this is what we are seeing with Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson. The report is a perfect example of institutional and structural racism at play in our energy system. And the work to move and transform our utilities to be better public actors, not actors that value the dollar, but value people. Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson, while focusing on housing and security issues, saw the deeply interconnected nature to energy insecurity and have brought their organizing and energy to the EDA to support the EDA's efforts in engaging and pushing for racially and economically just energy processes in the regulatory process in New York State. So that's what Anthony is bringing forward as it relates to our role in the EDA and the way that the EDA is trying to really have a lens that addresses multiple issues. The other movement work I wanted to bring forward is the work that we've done with the Hudson Valley Black Lives Matter Coalition. We see racial justice as such a central tenet to the work that we do, which is why the way that utility racism is played out is such an important issue that we've tried to address. And so with the Hudson Valley Black Lives Matter Coalition, of which we're a co-founder, we've tried to bring forward the struggle of utilities justice because of the fact that shutoffs have had such a disproportionate impact on Black consumers, which I just said, which as I just said, we've described as utility racism. And we know that fighting for a world where Black Lives Matter means actually reshaping many of the institutions that we experience as Black folks in this community. And that means, reshaping things like utilities, reshaping schools, reshaping police, and reshaping prisons. And so that's why we have this coalition that's made up of a number of organizations in the area that have a strong racial justice lens. And are working on areas of the fight such as education and police brutality and prison reform. And so, just to further go into the coalition itself, what the work that we've done as a coalition is really around responding in moments of crisis and responding around major national mobilizations that have happened in relation to the movement for Black Lives. so that's the work that we've done together with a number of organizations in the area as we try to build this bigger we, as we try to bring in, a variety of movements, because we know that what we're really trying to change is the system that makes this crisis possible, that makes the crisis around education possible, that makes the crisis around police brutality possible. And it's really going to take all of our movements and all of our work to make that change, make change that is going to be possible in the future. So to summarize this whole section, is really just the idea that utilities sits at the intersection of many struggles, from environmental justice to housing justice to racial justice to even like healthcare justice. It's really a multifaceted issue, and we think that having people come together around utilities has really allowed us to have a more collective struggle and to further that general fight for systemic justice.
Thank you. I think we're still missing Darnell, so I'm going to transition us into the question slide. We have a few questions here if they're interesting and generative for you all. If not, we want to just hear about your experiences with utility organizing if you have them, or questions that you have that we could parse our own experience. So you can throw those in the chat box. And I think Malcolm is going to help us moderate. Take a second to collect a few of those.
Yeah. So ironically enough, Darnell got booted off because the power in his office's building got shut out just now and went off. So apologies for Darnell. He sends his apologies. So we're going to try, and there's been a lot of questions and great comments, so trying to keep up with them. So the first one is from Gabriela. What kinds of alternative messaging have you used in your organizing that helps people understand this as a collective or structural issue versus an individual issue?
I think to lift up the idea of structural is something that we get from a great organization in the housing justice movement, City Life Vita Urbana. They have a lot of tools they use in their meeting to talk about leaving your shame at the door and not treating any issue as a truly individual issue, right? Because our society always wants to individualize something. And if you get a termination notice, it's like either pinned on your door or you get it in an envelope. And there's so few resources out there that it's a very, very personal and alienating experience. So I think what we try to do in a collective meeting space is to always reinforce this idea that, one, you're not alone, that we'll fight with you. We chant that when someone joins our group, or we do, frankly, the best we can to try to chant that as a group. Sometimes we struggle with some of our chanting. But we definitely try to emphasize that, and we always tell people, leave your shame at the door. This is truly a collective struggle. So I think those are some of the tools, and why we think it's particularly important to go beyond just the kind of legal advocacy tools. They will, keep the wolf from the door temporarily, but there is kind of no substitute to being in a collective space and saying we're in this together. So those are some of the tools that we use.
Thanks, Spencer. Anyone else want to speak to that question? All right, great. So Jackson asked, because y'all have statewide public policy aspirations, does that in any way make you feel like you have to temper how radical your public presence is or direct action is, especially if you're doing civil disobedience in your organizing?
I think that's a good question. I'm not sure if it's a question for partially funding, but I think that we have sort of staked ground as probably the organization that uses direct action as a tactic, and that is pushing for larger scale change in addition to pushing for these both local and statewide fights. And so I think that, like, in that position, we're actually able to continue to hold a more radical position. Yeah, I think that's the general explanation.
Yeah, I think there's always going to be tension and struggle around that, but I would agree. I think we've kind of staked a position that there's no way to win, but with, kind of asserting people power in different moments.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that's something that we've had to bring to other coalition spaces and to alliance spaces, and it's something that we are kind of continuously try to put forward as a way to build, the necessity of building power to really, have systemic change.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. And for other folks, we're actually I will change over from the listen only mode to the Q&A mode.
All attendees are muted and may unmute themselves by pressing *6.
Sorry about that. If there are folks who are on the call with organizing experience around this who want to share and jump in to some of these questions, you can use *6 on your phone to jump in. I know there's been mention of a number of groups, Pulp and George Wiley Center, and a number of others. I know there's a few others with us who have some of this experience as well. So there was a question from Gianna down at Esperanza, Peace and Justice, and wondering, saying this is an internal question, but how can we, or how have y'all successfully educated folks in your area about environmental racism? So they've used terms like, quote unquote, 17 white men to describe who runs the city. A political leader in town made a list of all the high developers, corporations, utilities, and the number came back to be 17 folks, all run by white men, all 17, all run by white men, even though our city is majority Latino. We've gotten a lot of pushback from other Latinos using this term as a frame. They refuse to believe that the people in power are not the ones they vote for. So how do we start tackling that?
A great question. It sounds like also a really important experience to highlight in Texas. I know part of our response is to, and Margaret mentioned this term, using the term utility racism, which is inspired by other groups, really talking about deeply structural issues in the context of racism. So I think what we see from Central Hudson is this really, they hate when we throw that kind of term out there. I think they've written to the Public Service Commission saying disregard the people at Nobody Leaves, they're libeling us basically. But I think the reason we see that irk them and really affect their thinking is because we're taking what they constantly assert as a neutral system and saying this isn't neutral at all, right? Is that the disparate outcomes that happen are where we need to be focused. And so I think by really continually calling it that, in spite of that the resistance that we get, I think we've seen that as a useful tool. But I'm not sure that I'd be interested in hearing more about how you work around that in Texas, because it is such a difficulty to be kind of constantly bringing that counter narrative. I don't know if you have more thoughts on that, Martin.
Yeah, I guess one way we've addressed it with members specifically was around using the framework of those 4 levels of racism around internalized, interpersonal, institutional, and then structural. Because I think that it can also be it's not always clear that that's what's happening on these multiple levels, that it is. That's not just my own fault. That's not just I'm not paying my bills. And I think that having gone through that that framework, specific to utilities has been helpful. In thinking about the ways that Central Hudson makes you feel badly about yourself, to the ways in which you have interactions on the phone with representatives of the company, to the ways in which you happen to be in this neighborhood that everyone just keeps getting shut off a lot faster than your friends out in the suburbs, to the ways in which that corporation works with other larger corporations, works in relation to schools, in relation to police, etc.
Maybe you could talk about this, Jonathan. Jonathan has a quick note to mention that I think illustrates a lot of the patterns that we had obviously been encountering for a long time, but we got in kind of interesting documents from a Central Hudson employee that maybe you could speak to.
Yeah, so towards the end of last year, we actually were mailed a letter from a Central Hudson employee anonymously, who was saying that the corporation has a lot of racist practices, and again, it's sort of intentionally treating people differently in terms of payment amounts they're asking for folks when they fall behind and shutting people off based on what they assess their race to be, because the company uses this defense a lot. They don't know the race of their customers, but they do have people's names, and they can make judgments based on people's voices when they hear them on the phone. And so what this letter was basically saying was that this is happening, and Black folks and Latino folks are getting disproportionately shut off. And I think for us, a lot of our members, it wasn't necessarily surprising, but it was still pretty impactful to see something that confirmed these experiences that our members had been feeling that they were getting disproportionately shut off and asked for higher payment plans if they were people of color.
Thanks, y'all. Let me put out this question, which is actually one that you put out to the audience, and I want to see if there's anyone in the audience who has some responses to this question. Margaret and the team laid out a number of strategic openings that they see are possible in embracing and prioritizing and in investing in utility justice organizing, right? And utility justice organizing that centers environmental justice, racial justice, and systematic change at its core. So what are the responses on the call to that? And where else do folks who are either doing this organizing or thinking about doing this organizing see strategic openings for expanding this work?
Hello?
Yes.
Hello. My name is Sean. I'm down here in Texas, and I trying a different approach, and I'm getting some pushback on it as well. And what I want to do is create a corporation to actually try and battle the other corporations, if I could use that. Down in Texas, and I'm sure it's in the nation, there's local government corporations where municipalities are allowed to create these nonprofit corporations. Now they get other business owners, and like the system was saying, they're usually white, they're rich, and then they have their people put in place. So the city councils appoint those board members. What I think we need to do is start trying to get local people, community people into those corporations. I want to teach people how to incorporate their businesses and just take the game one step further, because while they're pushing us to small business, minority-owned business, they're all playing in the corporation game. So I think I see that as one possible way to get in. But if you could look into your local codes and see if the same thing is happening out there. I know most of Texas is like that, this city has a bunch of nonprofit corporations which are allowed to, one, make loans with interest and collect the interest, operate for-profit businesses, and it's just crazy. But that's my little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Any response to that from Nobody Leaves, or does anyone else have reactions to where there's strategic openings? All right, well, let me put out one other question to the presenters, and folks should definitely feel free to chime in to any of the 4 questions on the screen, either by unmuting yourself with *6 or using the chat box. From Chloe has asked, in fighting for utility justice, have you been engaging in discussions or pushes to reform utility business models so that even if they do remain private, companies, their revenue is not tied to selling more electricity and building more infrastructure?
That's a really interesting question. I say that because we haven't looked into that. And I think maybe this speaks to the last point that was just raised, which I think is a helpful one. I think we see as really central the profit motive being a lever by which so many of these problems unfold. So even though it matters that utility corporations are always trying to beef up their revenues as much as possible and pass along those costs in the rate structure, the behaviors that I think that we've identified have the worst impact on people are driven by a for-profit model. So I think that's both in the demands we're making, but I think also in the way we talk about it. We want to highlight the difference between challenging the companies just because their rates are high or just because they have this pretty backwards business model. We don't think it's transformative enough to just say that. We want to also take on the logic of a for-profit model because there are alternatives in New York State, right? There are alternatives called energy service companies or ESCOs that were set up as part of this free market of corporations who would create a market solution to the problem of these backwards, lumbering, massive utility corporations, and they'd be lean and mean and all this other neoliberal rhetoric. And we found that those are just a nightmare, right? They're ruthlessly exploitative. They're basically a scam, and that's part of the legacy of deregulation. So I think it's important to challenge the logic of profit making and not just say you need a different business model, because that exists here in New York State, and it's been a nightmare. And I think you see some comments from Richard Berkeley and the folks at Pulp who have been taking on that issue very specifically. So that way, I don't know if that covers all the ground, but I think that's one of the ways we try to think about it.
Thanks, Spencer. So one other question that came up, and we'll have one or two more questions before we start closing out, is if there was a ask for talking a little bit more about alternatives to carbon taxes within this work. So if any of you have any other things you would like to add on that, or folks on the call would like to add anything on alternatives to carbon taxes.
We want to hear from y'all.
So just to repeat the question, any other insights on alternatives to carbon taxes? All right. Nobody leaves. Do y'all have any comments on this question, or Peggy? Oh, Richard saying in Pulp, the New York and New England RGGI alternative to a broader-based carbon tax. Richard, would you mind just clarifying what RGGI? Oh, Joel, thank you. Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative alternative is one suggestion. Thanks, Richard. Anyone of the presenters want to comment on this, or should we move on to the next question? Okay. So I know Peggy tried to answer this question a little bit in the chat box, but there was a question about old rental housing and the role of this organizing in working. Presumably, I understand this question is particularly with state public housing agencies to rehabilitate heating systems, utility systems in those properties, particularly since they've been financed by public money. And so a question about kind of the overlap between public housing, state housing agencies and as means for achieving just utilities. Any thoughts on that? Nobody leaves. Anyone else on the call?
Peggy, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, so this is the problem of usually multifamily public housing. And I know that in California, there are programs that particularly direct earmarked funds to weatherize and solarize multifamily low-income housing. I'm not sure that has arisen in the course of the work of Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson. I think there is a whole body of work around this issue in terms of public housing.
Great. Thanks, Peggy. And so if anybody has any other insights on that, we would love to hear them either on the call or following the call to really try and think about maybe that is a strategic opening where we can do that work. Last question that we're going to put out before we start closing out is from Jackson, which is in regard to weatherization. Any experience that organizers have in interacting with landlords who might be hesitant to make improvements where renters and tenants are living? And I know that y'all come out of doing foreclosure work and moving into utility justice work, and so the relationship between renters and landlords. Any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we see it as an organizing opportunity. It's one that we haven't dove into yet, partly because of the way the landlord structure works in Poughkeepsie. Really often small landlords that can be difficult to organize around. But at I was out with Trudy, one of our members in Chicago, hearing back from all these different Right to the City groups doing fantastic renter organizing work. I think the ability for people to collectively organize and make a demand of a landlord to take advantage of the weatherization services that are out there, to challenge their reluctance to do that is something that's really, really important. So I think, a lot of this webinar is about the linkage between housing and the environment and the bridge we're trying to span. It's not something that we've done yet, but it's something that I would, as an organizer, relish the opportunity to do, to say, let's organize and push our landlord to actually engage in weatherization that's going to be good for the environment and good for our costs. So I appreciate you raising that. I think it was Jackson or maybe some of the Detroit folks. We would love to see people pioneer that model and share back on it, because I think it's another way to make that connection.
Really, really deeply want to thank Peggy and the Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson crew. We want to thank all of you for being on. And I think coming off of that last comment is a really great transition into next steps and continuing this dialogue. So one, in terms of next steps, is we encourage everyone to download the report if you haven't already. You can download the report at homesforall.org/justutilities. You can even click right on this slide, and it'll take you right to that page. Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson is one of the groups among a number of other groups around the country that are even on this call, who are really pioneering this work. So we encourage you to sign up for their newsletter.
All attendees are muted.
And finally, sorry for the technical difficulties, everyone. We really encourage folks to join the new Homes for All Utility Justice Work Group that Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson is helping to coordinate and organize. There were 5 groups in Chicago who came together to form that work group. We know that there is organizing outside of Homes for All's network that is already happening, as well as groups within Homes for All that are interested in taking advantage and moving on these strategic openings and opportunities. So if you're interested in organizing, you're already organizing around utilities, you're interested in this question of where are there intersections both between housing justice and utility justice, but also intersections between utility justice and racial justice, housing justice and racial justice, the broader environmental justice movement, and a strong class analysis in how we're organizing for just utilities. We invite you and encourage you to join the work group. They're working on a growing toolbox and also beginning the conversations on how to really center utility justice struggles in a broader fight against displacement, gentrification, and rising housing costs. So if you're interested in that, you can email Spencer or Margaret at spencer@nobodyleavesmidhudson.org or margaret@nobodyleavesmidhudson.org. So finally, before we call, let's just want to thank you all so much for all of the work that went into this particular webinar. In 10 seconds, is there any last comment that y'all would want to share before we do our final slide? No, y'all are good? Great. So the last thing we want to put in a plug for is Homes for All partner organizations are organizing towards the first ever National Renters Day of Action on September 22nd. We invite and encourage any organization that is organizing against displacement, against rising rents, against evictions, or other forces that are pushing out our communities and targeting our cultures to take on planning and action that day or around that time. We are going to be providing support for groups that want to take on this work. But we want to put on the map that renters and our communities won't be displaced because of development. We won't be displaced because of rising housing costs, utility costs, rent prices. So we invite you all to join the National Renters Day of Action. You can pledge to take action at homesforall.org/rentersday. And you can also join Homes for All by taking the Homes for All pledge at homesforall.org/pledge. So I'm going to turn it back over to Spencer for one last word, and thank you all for being on with us today.
Hey, just wanted to thank everybody. Sorry, slow unmuting our phone there. But it was awesome to see some familiar names in the chat box and a lot of new folks. It seems like there's a lot of opportunities to build, and it's pretty clear to me that there's like lots of new ideas to explore. And I think this is our group, the other groups that are on today are the people who are going to be building this out. So I'm really excited to do that. I hope folks take the opportunity to connect with us. We're really eager to share and learn. And I just want to thank the Right to the City team for making this all possible. And Malcolm in particular for jumping in. Malcolm was not going to facilitate today. He just stepped up and did it, and that's awesome. So I want to give a heartfelt thanks to him. And once again, thank you all.